Welcome to this bonus episode of The Reading Cure. In this episode, we'll be discussing the film It's a Wonderful Life. Welcome to The Reading Cure, where mental health insights are our medication of choice. My name is Dr. Stephen Davis, and my co-host is Dr. Alexander Fox. Now, this episode is slightly different from our usual format. We won't be discussing a book this time around. Our next featured book will come in a fortnight. Instead, this is a bonus episode, and we'll be discussing the classic movie It's a Wonderful Life. Now, our intention is to continue making bonus episodes alongside our regular content, but in future, these will be only available to our Patreon subscribers. And if you would be interested in supporting us on Patreon, you just need to check out patreon.com/The Reading Cure. And both membership tiers that are available there will have access to bonus episodes as and when we make those. We're viewing the bonus episodes as a chance to experiment a bit, and so, for example, we have a number of other iconic films lined up that we're intending to cover in the coming months. But turning now, though, to the movie that we'll be focusing on in this episode, It's a Wonderful Life was released in 1946 and was produced and directed by veteran filmmaker Frank Capra. The film has been described as a fantasy of goodwill, and the plot is based on a novella entitled The Greatest Gift by Philip Van Dorenstern, which was published 3 years prior to the film It's a Wonderful Life. Frank Capra was a self-made Italian-American immigrant whose own life story was one of dogged perseverance in the face of real hardship, and which led one film critic to describe him as the American dream personified. By 1946, Capra was on the top of his game, having previously enjoyed enormous success with films such as It Happened One Night, You Can't Take It With You, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's a Wonderful Life tells the story of George Bailey, played by Hollywood legend Jimmy Stewart. George is a man who has continually sacrificed his own dreams to look after his community, the town of Bedford Falls, and who has reached a crisis point on Christmas Eve due to the disappearance of $8,000 from his building and loans enterprise. He is saved from the brink by the intervention of Clarence, his guardian angel, who shows George what life would have been like had he never been born. Upon realising how much he still wants to live, George returns home to find that his family, friends and neighbours have rallied together to raise the money needed to rescue him from prosecution, and in so doing, show just how much they love and value him for the protection and kindness he has bestowed upon them throughout their lives. More than 7 decades after this iconic film was first released, it remains as popular as ever with audiences, and particularly, of course, at Christmas time. So the first question tonight, Alec, that we're going to discuss was this great film, It's a Wonderful Life. What do you think it is that has made it so enduringly popular as a kind of Christmas holiday staple?
Well, perhaps we should mention to our listeners, first of all, that when this movie came out, it actually wasn't a commercial success. It was only when it had gone into syndication that it became this Christmas favourite that we all know and love.
Yes.
So it took a while, actually, for it to achieve the status that it has, which is interesting. For some reason, after the war, people just didn't seem to take to this movie too much. But I think it might have been decades later that it was redeemed. This is something that Jimmy Stewart had mentioned in his interview with, Michael Parkinson.
Yeah,
that it did actually achieve that status with time. But I think we can sort of see why it would have achieved that status with time. I mean, one of the reasons is that it is a classic Christian Christmas tale. George Bailey is the epitome of altruism, someone who has dedicated his life to Bedford Falls and the residents in Bedford Falls. And he illustrates his good as anyone I can think of, the spirit of loving thy neighbour. Because for George Bailey, the whole of Bedford Falls are his neighbours, are his brothers that he looks out for, and he dedicates his life to it. So to them. So it's very much in the spirit of Christianity. So I can see why it would be a staple of Christmas time.
Yeah.
Another reason that is a bit more subtle is that this is also, as you know, a morality tale in that good triumphs over evil, evil being represented by Mr. Potter in this movie. So it's a tale of redemption, of good winning out. Where it's really interesting is that the redemption is actually George Bailey being saved from himself. And this is something that we could look at in more detail when we talk about his character, is that he lacks faith in himself. He lacks faith in the goodness of his character and the goodness of his actions. And he actually needs to be saved from himself, which is one of the most interesting and poignant things about this movie.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think you've made some great points about it there, Alec. And as you said, we'll come back to the issue of George Bailey and this journey that he's on a little bit later. I would just like to pick you up really on the first issue about the film and its success, because certainly looking at this film now from a kind of more modern perspective, it's clearly a beautifully made film by a master craftsman, which I think Frank Capra was, and it's interesting that it was this box office flop at the time. It obviously did very well with the critics. It had, I think, 5 Oscar nominations when it came out, but as you described, it was maybe something about this, immediate aftermath of World War II. I don't know if it was the fact that it's quite dark in some ways, this film. It's an interesting blend of dark and comic and warm and, all sorts of complex things going on. But obviously something about it, it didn't hit the spot at the time, but it has stood the test of time so remarkably well. That's such an old film.
It has.
It
has. I think you're right that Capra is a master craftsman, and this is probably him articulating his artistic vision. Him at his most eloquent in articulating his artistic vision there. I mean, what you say about it being dark, that makes total sense. Having dark elements, almost film noir elements as part of the movie. Whether that's the case, I don't really know. I've actually got a quote here from Barbara Deming, who wrote a brilliant book about 1940s film called Running Away From Myself. A great book, but not very well known. But what she says about movies from that period is that they depict, and this is the quote, a nightmare realm where visions tantalise but deceive. What seems substantial may prove insubstantial. What promises life may bring death. Nothing is sure. That is her summary of a lot of 1940s movies. And so you can see if she's right, and I think she is, if you go through her book and all the movies that she covered. She watched hundreds of movies in that period.
Yep.
And she says that they're quite nightmarish when you look at them closely and critically. So, this wouldn't have been that different. The darkness doesn't quite explain away why it wasn't popular at the time.
Well, indeed. I mean, it's an odd comparison in a way, but I mean, you mentioned the film noir elements potentially, and the extended flashback sequence at the start of the film is quite like the classic Robert Mitchum movie Out of the Past, where a character's in difficult circumstances and we have this protracted narrative to explain it. So there is a kind of strange mixture, and it did strike me as well that the complex mixture of elements that Capra's put into this film make it seem almost a bit like a play to me. The tragi-comedy, we've mentioned darkness, but for example, the scene where young George has defied his boss, the chemist, who's in a state of despair at losing his son, and then he hasn't handed over the medication because he knows it has poison in it, and then the chemist hits him on his sore ear, and you see his ear bleeding. It's quite dark. This, and of course, then there's the kind of moment of realization where there's then the affection comes out. In the chemist, and you see he's this kind of flawed, wounded, but still fundamentally decent man, actually. You know, he does care about George, but he's at such a low point. So yeah, it's really real in that way. You know, really just the depth you would expect in a great play, I think, comes through in this film.
Yeah. I mean, it is amazing the tonal variety of the movie, and it is amazingly brought about by Jimmy Stewart, because the most wonderful thing about this wonderful movie is his performance, the range within that. He's comic when he needs to be comic. He is despairing at the point where he needs to be despairing. He shows his love intensely at key points in the movie. That there's a little scene where he's standing outside his house and he hears the train go past, and the look of longing on his face. I mean, it is one of the best moments I've ever seen in a movie. It's one of the greatest performances that I've ever seen. So, yeah, we certainly have to pay tribute to him, because he really knocked it out of the park in this movie. It required a lot from the actor, and he delivered, amazingly.
I completely agree. I mean, I think the casting issue is actually an interesting one, because just in preparing for this, I was reading a little bit about the genesis of this film, and as it was being, the concept was being passed around Hollywood, various writers actually before Capra were working on it. Apparently at one point Cary Grant was being considered for the leading role, but it's interesting, as you say, Jimmy Stewart, it seems just absolutely perfect for this role. It's interesting, actually, this slightly leads on to the second issue we're going to discuss, because obviously Jimmy Stewart has often been seen as the kind of Hollywood everyman, just the person you go to have a kind of really identifiable everyman type character. But obviously George Bailey could be seen as that to some degree, but he's also a very exceptional person. You know, he seems to be both to me. So I was wondering, what do you think? Would you see his kind of the selfless choices he makes in this film as we get to know him? Do you think that is from a character who's been produced by just the ideal kind of environment, or do you think this is really more a statement about this man's kind of unique, innate qualities? How would you read George Bailey?
Well, I think it's actually a bit of both. Regarding the innate aspect of it, this is something that his father invokes when they're sitting at the dinner table, and his father says, comparing him to one of his brothers, he said, "George, you were born older." So he is basically invoking this idea that George is more mature, more watchful, supportive, empathic than most for their age. And I think a really good example, something that you mentioned earlier on, was how he handled that incident with Old Man Gower when he was about 9 years of age, because he notices that he's put the poison capsules, in that bottle to give to a patient, and he saves Old Man Gower's skin. He's only 9 years of age. It's remarkable how watchful and empathic he is. I think that's why they included it in the movie, to show that this is no ordinary person, because 9-year-olds generally wouldn't be looking out for others to that extent, unless I'm doing them a disservice here. So I think he is, very morally precocious. And you could say that when he becomes an adult, he actually looks out for the poison that is Potter and ensures it doesn't infect the town. So he is the person that is looking out for others. He's done that from a young age. So I think there is an innate quality there of empathy, sympathy, support, watchfulness, care. Really, this is a person that even as a kid cares deeply about others. So there's definitely an innate dimension there. But I think he's also been shaped by his environment. That's no surprise, because if you look at his father, you could say that he is conscripted into his father's life. Not by choice, but it's like a conscription, isn't it, really? I don't want to say it was like entering the army for George Bailey, because he was the best man to do the job, and it's not as though he wouldn't want to have done it at all, but he wasn't, completely accepting that role.
No.
But his father is like the role model, his vision of the good. I mean, as a kid, he says, Pop, I think you're the biggest man in town.
Yes,
As an adult, he says that I think that you're a great person. So his idea of what it is to be a good person has been deeply shaped by his father and his father's life and his father's vacation. Very interestingly, though, while he feels that about his father, he didn't want to become his father, and yet he has to, and this is a key part of the drama.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment there. I think there is the both the temperamental and the environmental at play there. I think that's true because he has a very clearly defined character, as you described. He's an interesting mixture of being both passionate but warm, considerate, outgoing but also thoughtful of others. A real mixture. And yeah, the scene you referred to where we see the family dinner when he's youngish, and his brother's there and so on. You get a sense of a family that are supportive of each other, that are caring, that are sociable. There seems to be a lot of healthy things happening in that environment. It struck me as well that I think Capra is making really a statement about the importance of the individual, actually, in terms of the shaping of George Bailey, because the nightmare scenario of Pottersville that George experiences later in the film, it shows how much this one individual was so integral to, this community being this wholesome place compared to what it could have been. So that's really, to me, a strong statement of the role of this kind of innately good person and how much he, other people shaped in similar communities weren't nearly as important to the health of it all as George, So obviously he as an individual is key. Obviously,
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is a key part of the message that Capra wants to convey, which is that the ordinary may be the extraordinary. Because if you compare George's life on paper to his brother's life, he receives the Congress Medal of Honor and things like that, and then Sam Wainwright that becomes a captain of industry. George isn't looking too good in comparison there, but the movie proves how exceptional he is and how exceptional and wonderful his life has been, and that he is actually the richest man in town. There's the irony and the depth there. Potter is, on paper, the richest man in town, but he's very poor in a sense too. And George is precisely rich in the way that Potter is poor.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it, that, obviously the film is very overtly religious, of course, and the premise that, different, in a way, what's right for George is not right for other characters. It's almost like his place on earth to be one that sacrifices his own wishes for the good of others. That's what he's there to do. And others actually don't have to do that. Others that are maybe, not aside from Potter, others that are decent characters within the film, they simply don't have that put upon them. But for George, that's what he's there for, as it's kind of conceived here.
And he is reluctant about that. That's something that we could talk about later on, no doubt, is that he has a reluctance about being elected to that role. But as you say, the movie makes it very clear that nobody else could do that role. Certainly no one else as good as him. I mean, you've got Uncle Billy, who's very well-meaning, but makes a tremendous gaffe at a key point in the movie. Clearly, he could not run the building alone. It had to be George. Yes, I mean, even though he didn't ultimately want to do it, he was the right man for that job. As long as he believed in the building alone as a means for ordinary people to have a decent life, he had to step up and take up that role as guardian of the community, really, against the poison that is represented by Potter.
Yes, and I thought it was quite Capra's films are often seen as a kind of depiction of the American dream. And I thought it was quite an interesting one, the way that the American dream here is fused with this morality, this Christian perspective, actually, whereby, as you just suggested, he becomes the richest man in town. But say, unlike maybe subsequent Hollywood movies that show an American dream kind of storyline, he doesn't become rich, he doesn't become a celebrity in that sense. He's obviously loved and revered in the community, but it's a very different kind of American dream, actually, although it is an American dream. It's this sense that it's not about wealth. It's absolutely not about that. It was an interesting message there from Capra, actually.
Well, I think, that's a very good point, that it is not your typical American dream where an individual rises from inauspicious beginnings and then becomes this great success in a material sense and in a celebrity sense. In fact, it's quite the opposite, because George's life, the trajectory of his life, is totally within Bedford Falls. And yet I think what Capra wanted to highlight is that community was the most important thing, really. Looking out for each other, caring about each other, supporting each other. This is what was a key part of his ethic. And his view would be that if you did not contribute in that way, you may be very rich, but you would be very poor. And you might recall that George's father says that if Potter has a soul, even. So there's this idea that, as you say, it's invoking Christian ideas too, that if you're actually like a vampire living off of the community but not contributing it as hyper-capitalist Potter is like, then you are very poor in some sense too. And this is something that we can look at later on, because I think it is such a key psychological point as well.
Well, indeed, yeah. I mean, we'll come, to that very issue of Potter's psychology. Just the final point to add on that, I think it is quite interesting that, as you've described it there, this critique of a kind of unhealthy vampiric capitalism in the form of Potter, that this has actually come from Capra, who is generally, I think, described as quite a conservative Republican, actually.
Yes.
And we, as we've alluded to previously, you see the individualistic outlook in a moral sense, and you see the religious elements actually coming together there. But he's definitely more, I think, in the sort of Lincoln than the kind of Reagan kind of school of republicanism there, really, because it's definitely, he's not comfortable actually with this idea that people make a fortune and don't share it, so he's not that kind of conservative actually there, it's not so I mean, that's
an excellent point. He's not he's not on the libertarian right.
No.
It would have been interesting to watch this movie with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, because they probably would have thought that Potter was much maligned in this movie. But Capra, as you say, was a Republican, and there is a traditionalist bent to his way of looking at the world. Yep. And I think we see that also in John Hughes' movies, who was also a Republican, the emphasis on family and community. I mean, he is a spiritual son, in a way, of Capra. When we look at Home Alone and movies like that, how much he extols community and reintegrating people into that community too. So John Hughes, as a Republican, I think had the same outlook there, and a similar artistic vision in some regard too.
Yeah, I think that's a good connection to draw, actually. Yeah, the John Hughes link, because you're absolutely right. He's one of the, in that sense, there is a real fellowship there with Capra.
Yes, yeah.
And it is. It's all about community. But it's interesting, isn't it, that it's communities that are built by good people. It's not this. It's not a collectivist view either, really. It's not about people like Bailey being in a very kind of statist way, a kind of construction of their education and their morality. It's just more, it's families and small communities and people, the good people, really contributing in those communities. So,
exactly. And I think that's another great point, is that it's not the state from afar constructing these communities. And we could see why, because the danger with that is that they don't really understand the town. And so they impose a structure on the town rather than it actually being built up by the town members that understand the town, are part of the town, understand the citizens of that town.
Just maybe moving on to the third question then, because we've alluded to Potter and his psychology. It's such an intriguing character, and as has been pointed out, there is a kind of he's reminiscent in some ways of Scrooge, of course, because I believe the book from which It's a Wonderful Life was derived was itself, and a sort of homage to the Scrooge story. What do you? So in the case of Potter, though, unlike Scrooge, he doesn't have any kind of moral epiphany. He remains a villain throughout this film. There's no sense that he comes to terms with himself. So what would you make of the psychology of a Potter then, Alec?
Well, I think the psychology of Potter is somewhat limited by the function that he performs in the story. As I said earlier on, there are tonal shifts and tonal elements that are different to each other in this movie, and to some extent Potter is not quite a pantomime villain, but he lacks the nuance of portrayal that we get with George Bailey. And I think the reason for that is that Capra wants to show in a very direct and stark form what he thinks is a threat to the American way of life. And this is what Potter represents. So he is not granted or dignified with any inner conflicts in the way that Scrooge was in his story.
Yep.
Not as far as I can see. I don't see any issue that Potter has with the life that he's leading. He has no qualms about the life that he's leading, as far as we can tell in the story. So he is a secondary character, and he is a character without inner conflict. So his psychology is going to be naturally more limited and less nuanced than George Bailey, who does have his conflicts, does have his tensions within his psyche. Having said that, I do think that if we were to talk about Potter's psychology, we could still discuss it and explore it. And there's a number of ways of doing this. I mean, I don't want to infringe on Todd Grandy's turf territory here, but we could look at Mr. Potter through the lens of the ocean. The big five traits of openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Yep. And I think what we would see with Potter is that he is low in openness, so he's very fixed and prejudicial in his outlook. We can see that he's cynical. He's prejudicial against what he thinks is the mob. That's how he describes the residents of Bedford Falls. So he's someone that doesn't think outside the box, that's quite for sure. So he's not high in openness. Conscientiousness, he makes the rules. He doesn't really follow rules by and large. So he would be low in conscientiousness. He is very unscrupulous. We see that, don't we? That has someone high in conscientiousness or medium in conscientiousness would not keep that $8,000, wouldn't they?
Indeed, yeah.
And also the way he lives his life, because he wants to suck at every penny out of the Bedford Falls citizens' hands, really. So he's low in conscientiousness. In terms of extroversion, he will be an introvert, I'm sure, because he leads quite a hermit, reclusive life. So very low in extroversion. In other words, a real introvert. In terms of agreeableness, he will be low in agreeableness. That's why he's so cynical and disputatious and distrusting. And then he's high in neuroticism, because, he gets easily irritable, he's greedy, he can't be at peace until he has everything within his clutches. So if we saw him in terms of the big five traits in psychology, that would be his psychological profile.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, yeah. So it's funny. I kind of came at this one from a slightly different angle there. And it's funny because you mentioned that as a character, Potter, I think you're right, like Scrooge, doesn't display the sort of sense of being conflicted in an inner sense. I think I was still thinking about our Karen Horney episode previously, where we looked at her book Our Inner Conflicts, because it kind of struck me that you know, one way you could read a character like a Potter, or the Potters that there are is out there, would be somebody who is maybe in the moving against category.
Yes, yeah.
You know, he's obviously somebody who has repressed his loving, affectionate dimension, and he's emphasised the aggressive, domineering aspects of him. So, for example, that, you know, he's strikingly absent in empathy. Obviously, we see, for example, in the scene where George Bailey's father has just died, Potter, you know, gives a few platitudes and immediately wants to dissolve the building and loans company, you know. So there's absolutely not an ounce of genuine sorrow or sympathy at all there. And it's also striking that these elements of his character are kept in check by this cynical worldview that he espouses, whereby he has this very cliched interpretation of others as just weak, corrupt, needy creatures. He says to George Bailey, of course, when George is in his moment of crisis, you know, go and get help from the rabble that you love so much. You know, he doesn't. And of course, actually, sadly, George potentially lets this infect his mindset, because he doesn't actually think that maybe he could get help from others. You know, he's almost going to commit suicide until, of course, Clarence, you know, pulls him back from the brink, and it's his wife that goes out and actually gets the help for him. But yeah, but coming back to Potter, I think, yeah, you could imagine somebody who maybe had felt that they were at risk of exploitation by others very early in life and had developed this hard, cynical persona and buried their more affectionate dimensions, and therefore, you know, repress and project the kind of more infantile dependent traits out onto the community and everybody else. So that was my kind of Karen Horney type reading of Potter. But I do take your point. I think we are essentially dealing with a more secondary, you know, less rounded character here. I think that's true.
Well, I mean, I was actually going to give a Karen Horney reading as well, but you've done it anyway, so I don't need to do it, because I wasn't going to just leave it at the Ocean kind of level, because I think that he does very much represent the moving against character type, because he sees life as a jungle, and he has to succeed, he has to be victorious, and there can even be vindictive triumphs, because I think essentially him keeping the money and letting George go to the wall is a vindictive triumph for this man. The way he looks at human beings are, you know, is like vermin, creatures to exploit, really, but also he's very wary of them, because he's probably externalizing, as we discussed in the Karen Horney episode, you know, people projecting aspects of their own psychology onto others. So since he is so mercenary, so ruthless, and so greedy, how could he trust others if he sees them in the light of his own psyche? And that's why there'll be this braying mob willing to take every last penny from him, unless he kind of keeps them under his thumb, really.
That's a great point. And of course, insofar as he at any point in his life went any distance towards cultivating any kind of more affectionate elements of himself, it doesn't seem like he went far at all with that. But, you know, these will be so repressed that he'll simply be seeing neediness in others. You know, he won't be seeing genuine love, actually. It'll just simply be they want to get one over. They're weak, and, you know, love and weakness are the same thing, actually, for Potter, I think, aren't they, really?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, what we really see, love is weakness for him. He has no affectionate ties. He has no family. This is something that Capra makes clear, that he is a bachelor. He is without kids. He's without wife and kids. The only tie he has is actually his servant, and we can see that is not remotely close or affectionate or considerate in any way. In fact, actually, he just sees him solely as a servant, as a tool, really, there to look after him, and that's as close as he gets to any other human being. So it very much puts it in perspective that this is a man without affectionate ties. What we can sort of see is that, in a way, the battle between Potter and George is a battle of good and evil, but what I think it also is a battle between love and fear, because what we see with Potter is a man that is essentially consumed by fear. And but because he has a good brain on him in that sort of financial kind of sense, in a calculating way, what he epitomizes is, a calculated fear, somebody that's very shrewd in a sense, but also deeply fearful. And that is how he looks at the world, through a strategic lens. It's always strategic.
That's very interesting, yeah, because one that ties in actually. One kind of interesting psychological nuance I thought with Potter was that on the one hand, as you described, he seizes the opportunity for vindictive revenge on George when the circumstances prevent themselves, and that's understandable given that understandable from Potter's point of view, given that George has embarrassed him previously, so he'll have cultivated that hatred. But he's also actually willing to make George rich at a certain point. He offers him this job. He's willing to, he doesn't have, in a way, his hatred of George is actually trumped by the strategic concerns there, because if he can get total control over, say, the housing and the banking sectors within the town, he's willing to actually tolerate making George rich, so I thought that was quite an interesting kind of dynamic there. So I think
exactly, he is willing to contain his contempt for George to gain a strategic advantage. It would be a little bit like a grandmaster giving away a rook in order to take somebody's queen, really, which is Bedford Falls, basically. So yes, I mean, obviously he has been, not in a moral sense, but in a financial sense, he's been a very effective man. And I think that's where we see his effectiveness, that as contemptuous as he is towards George Bailey, he is willing to offer him that money, that job, so that he could ultimately win Bedford Falls. Now, of course, George is tempted very briefly, because George, as we know, is a somewhat conflicted man, and maybe also Potter had noticed that. If he did, he certainly exploited it. But George ultimately, very quickly actually, realizes what he's doing. He knows moral poison when he sees it, and that is what saves Bedford Falls.
Yeah, I think that sums it up perfectly there. You're quite right. It's the master chess player, the master strategist. Yeah, he comes up against this, this man who is good, but of course conflicted, because he's having to balance, he's having to balance other people's needs with his own desires in a way that Potter simply doesn't. And yeah, as you said, he is tempted, but only very briefly. And then, as proves to be the case with George, he makes the right choice. I was going to just mention a couple of other things regarding his psychology, because it ties in a bit with the Karen Horney aspect, which is Alfred Adler's idea about superiority as well. Indeed.
That his view was that every human being feels inferior, and they then search out some means to compensate for that, and they can do it in two fundamentally different ways, pro-socially or anti-socially. And what we see with Potter is a great example of someone that has taken the anti-social route to compensating for whatever perceived inferiority he felt he had. And what Adler said was that route would be to triumph over others, to see others as inferior, to exploit them, basically, which was very different to the pro-social route. So yes, I mean, for therapists out there, if they know Alfred Adler, they can see Mr. Potter as an Adlerian case study in that way. The other thing I was just going to mention very briefly is Erich Fromm's idea of having and being. His great book, To Have or To Be.
Yes.
And one of the things that Fromm had said was that the more that you're focused on acquiring material things, the less being that you would have. And what he essentially meant by that was that the more you identify with things, the more they own you, and the more you're kind of constrained in what you could become. So in his view, it kind of created this inner void there. And I think what we see with Potter is a great example of someone that has a lot, but his being is very poor. I mean, this is almost like a Fromian reading of what Capra is saying in the movie. And it's really why Potter is a vampiric character, ultimately, preying off of the Bedford Falls, capitalising on them, but not giving anything in return. He has nothing to give in return, actually, on a psychological and spiritual level.
Yeah, I think that those readings work really well, actually, because there is, on the one, in terms of the From point, there is that discontentment about him. He can't actually sit at ease on the fact he owns the vast majority of the town, because there's still something he hasn't yet got, and it's like there's nothing else motivates him in life, actually. There's nothing else he can channel his energies in. And I think also, I thought that was a good point, actually, about the Adlerian and inferiority complex and the antisocial route, because obviously another striking thing about Potter is that he's not particularly concerned that people know what he's like. You know, he has these slums that are in terrible conditions. He knows that people hate him and have contempt for him, but he has contempt for them, and it doesn't bother him, actually. He doesn't feel a need to try to look good, actually. It's more, as you said, the antisocial triumph and the domination that's the bottom line for him. So yeah, I think those are great links to draw there. Yeah, excellent.
I think you're very right that he doesn't care about image.
No.
Really. Maybe we're dealing with a period where fame and notoriety, the way that we know it and understand it, didn't exist at that point. So he is happy to be the local villain as long as he is actually the one that triumphs. But I suppose if you want to see it from his point of view, which is not a comfortable thing to think about,
Sure.
but if you want to see it from his point of view, they're all suckers anyway. So they're the more that they have contempt for me, the more I've succeeded. That would be his logic.
Yes, I think that's true, isn't it? Yeah, he has so little respect for these people that whether they happen to like him or hate him, as they generally do, it's a minor issue to him. He sees them as like insects in a way. He's that kind of detached from them. Yeah,
actually, he would want their liking, because I think he would believe that he's done something wrong.
Yeah,
and also he would trust it, because he'd think it would be some strategic ploy to get one over on him.
Yes. Coming next then to his nemesis, as he would see it, George Bailey. Obviously this is such a kind of remarkable character that people, so many people have seen this film and loved it, and think about this character as an almost exemplar of goodness. So the next question I thought could be interesting to consider in terms of therapeutic value. To what extent should we actually try to be like George Bailey in our own lives? Is this a good model that people should be following, do you think?
Well, I think it's the case that for most of us, we could take a leaf from George Bailey's book, because we have here almost the epitome, as far as realism could go anyway, almost the epitome of someone that is, tremendously generous and very kind, and very empathic. So it would be hard not to say that we could take a leaf out of George Bailey's book, most of us anyway, because I don't. Here's me speaking for most people here, but I imagine that they do think that they could have been kinder, more generous towards others. And George Bailey is a role model in many ways, an ideal to look towards, not in that self-hating Karen Horney kind of sense. No. But a moral ideal. So to say that we should identify with them at all would be a great mistake, I think. But what I think would be equally a mistake, and this is difficult to talk about, because this is the kind of thing that that people or some people rage against critics for, which is looking at a movie in quite a sober and and to some people's point of view, clinical way.
Okay.
But I don't want to be accused of being like Addison DeWitt from All About Eve here. but I think that we also shouldn't completely identify with this character. There are difficulties here, because having a wonderful life isn't solely about giving. We have to be careful here. The reason I mention this is that I do think I see quite a lot of clients who have been casualties to some extent of their own altruism. A wonderful life does involve giving, but it doesn't involve solely giving. I think that we need to look at the shadow side of the story to some extent, and we mustn't see our moral choices as a decision to be either Bailey or Potter.
Yes.
I think it is much more nuanced than that in real life. So a couple of things I want to say in general before looking at George himself is that, as you know, in real life, if we do good, if we act in a good way towards others, if we help others, we might come across a thing known as ingratitude, or we may indeed be exploited. What we see in this movie is a world where ingratitude and exploitation don't exist in Bedford Falls.
Okay.
You see?
Yep.
We see in Potter, obviously, a host of dislikable and morally reprehensible characteristics, but it's contained within this one character.
Yes.
Everybody in Bedford Falls seems ideal, seems appreciative, grateful towards George. It would be a mistake to think that that's how it is in real life, unfortunately, because a lot of good goes unsung and unappreciated. So the reason I'm underscoring this is that I know a lot of people want to help others, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we also have to keep in mind how others treat us in return, and we can't expect them to be like the citizens of Bedford Falls. In reality, much as I regret to say this, if we are altruistic in an unthinking and in a compulsive way, what we might end up with is not a wonderful life, but a wasted life. And this is something that we have to bear in mind, despite the very affirmative dimensions of this movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, actually. Although, as you said, yeah, it's kind of, people like the magic of these films, and there can be a sensitivity to that kind of way of looking at it. But I think it's, what's clear about this film is that there is this religious perspective, which is very overt in it. And to me, there is this underlying magical belief at play here, or magical reality, whereby goodness is rewarded. George Bailey is rewarded for his sacrifice by meeting the perfect wife, having wonderful, caring neighbours. And yeah, I think that the reality, as you've just been depicting, is that altruism isn't always going to be recognised. There isn't necessarily always going to be this kind of, as we might feel there should be, this automatic mechanism in nature whereby our sincere attempts at kindness are then met with kindness and appreciation in return. So there is a problem there, isn't there, really, where if a person,
absolutely,
just to try to follow the George Bailey script, there is no guarantee of a George Bailey wonderful life result. Unfortunately, it's magical thinking that, really, isn't it?
It is. I mean, because this movie, as great as it is a dream for the altruist.
Yeah,
that's why it's so seductive and potentially dangerous on one level, because it what happens to George at the conclusion of this movie is what every altruist would want, to be appreciated in that sincere way, in that celebratory way. But as you say, that is unlikely in real life, or it doesn't always happen, if we're going to just put it in a euphemistic sort of way. And I think a really key point to underscore here is that being moral isn't about, we mustn't equate being good with sacrifice. This is one of the problems, I think, you get more with that religious perspective, which is that the more you sacrifice, the more good that you are.
Yeah.
And I think that is a mistake. The reason why it's a mistake is that other people aren't more important than oneself. I know that might sound a bit, ungenerous to say, but I think it's about respecting oneself as much as you respect others, and to sacrifice yourself in this vision of the good could lead to a wasted life. It certainly doesn't lead to a life of self-actualization, which is another key part of morality, of ethics. And there is a danger if you lived your life like George that you may actually not realize your own potentials. In this movie, that is sort of dealt with because George has got such a resounding level of appreciation that the fact that he didn't go off to college and develop himself in other ways is kind of then swept under the carpet. But in real life, we have a commitment to others and a commitment to ourselves, and we mustn't forget that.
Yeah, I think that is an extremely important point, because I mean, on the one hand, as you were initially describing, we can take something from George Bailey, which is that it's absolutely right to reflect that when we're making choices in our life, we take into account the effect those have on others. So we make those choices, not purely from a this is what I want, so this is what I'm going to do perspective. So that's right. That's a good message. But yeah, I mean, the reality is, George himself, or a character like George in the real world, who's a good person, also deserves. There's this idea that he somehow needs to always sacrifice for others. That seems unfair to him. And, in the real world, as you say, I mean, a person does have the right in their, limited time on this planet to try to make a good, satisfying life for themselves. And it would seem to be running a real risk of ending up actually quite a bitter, resentful person if you simply sacrifice to others all the time and quash your own strong desires, in his case, say, venturing out in the world, having some exploration. These are, well, I mean, the exploration, of course, is one of the higher needs. You mentioned Maslow there, that Kaufman mentions as when a person is in the realm of self-actualizing, there is a bit of that in their life. So fair enough, there may be circumstances where the morally right thing to do is actually to put others first, because your own, in a particular case, it might be that your own preference is going to have too many people will suffer if you're not there for them. But I think most people's lives don't go from these kind of critical moment to moments in the way that George does, whereby every self-interested choice equals disaster for the community, and so therefore it must always be sacrifice all the way. I think that's not really the world that people are in. So that would be definitely, I would have thought, a mistake for people to think.
I think that's a very good point. One other thing, more general point I would also want to make here is that I was reading this interesting book by a sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman called Liquid Love. And what he was talking about in this book was the kind of relationships we have in post-modernity. And what he was saying is that in the modern world, people have a kind of ambivalent connection to others. The way he describes it is that we want to be connected, but on the other hand, we don't want to be too connected because it may become a burden, a tie, and it might become something that limits our freedom, our ability to move about in a way that the modern world allows us to do. And I think he's got a point that the way that we relate nowadays is sadly more transactional and less committed than what the citizens of Bedford Falls would be like. So this is another thing that we have to keep in mind if we're trying to emulate George Bailey, is that we are not of George Bailey's time. And what that may indeed mean is that we act altruistically towards others, but others may not be much around in many ways, and they may leave and things like that. So it's not as though we're going to get quite the celebration or recognition that George had received.
No, that is a very important point as well. Actually, yeah, the Bedford Falls world, and I think part of the more escapist appeal of the film is the fact that it is so different to the world we find ourselves in now. I think that's true. Another thing that occurred to me as well, actually, is that the way it's depicted in this film, whereby the absence of George means Bedford Falls becomes Pottersville. You could say that there is something in the idea that certain exceptional individuals can be these community leaders, fair enough, and create these. But you could also conceive of something akin to a Bedford Falls-like close-knit community actually being constructed if, rather than a few exceptional individuals, the majority of the people there, to some degree, were able to live in a more balanced way, whereby they thought about their own needs but also those of others. It didn't just come down to a few sacrificers, and obviously we've mentioned Maslow. People can reach these higher needs more, the giving and the love and so on, if their deficiency needs are met. And obviously if you have a community where people are attentive enough to their own needs, actually, that they can meet those deficiency needs, you could create something more close-knit and caring, but it wouldn't just rely on soul sacrificers. Actually, I don't think that's maybe the way to realistically probably achieve that.
I think that's a very good point. And because this is a movie, particularly a Hollywood movie, there has to be a protagonist. So there is an emphasis on the individual. But as you say, that distorts the message in some way. And I think that Capra would have advocated that in real life, more people try and be like George up to a point.
Yes.
Anyway, but as you say, also looking out for themselves, but not in a Potter-like way, in a self-interested way, but not a selfish way, really there. So yes, I think that's a key thing to keep in mind as well when assessing the movie and also its import on our own lives.
Yeah.
But yes, I was going to move on to George's psychology.
Oh, please
itself.
do. Yeah. Yep.
Here, what I would call more the shadow side of it, because obviously if we watch the movie in a straightforward way, it could seem quite simple, his psychology, that he dedicates his life to Bedford Falls. He then realises how much he is given to that community, and then he is celebrated in a time of need by that community. That is sort of the most straightforward reading of the movie. But I think if we look at his psychology a bit more closely, we see a number of elements that indicate that we have to be a little bit wary about emulating George, at least completely. I mean, one of them is that, and this is what drives a lot of the story, is that he has a lack of confidence in his own goodness and his own good acts. Yeah. I mean, he calls his father the biggest man in town. He calls him a great guy when he's older, but George did not feel that about himself. And so when he reaches that crisis point when the $8,000 goes missing, he doesn't remotely feel confident about his moral status. Instead, he is despairing and immensely self-doubting, and that's why Clarence, as his guardian angel, has to arrive and show him actually how good he has been by indicating how life would have been without him. Yes. But he doesn't have remotely a clue about that. And this is something that I think is worth exploring about his psychology, that lack of confidence in his own goodness, why that came about. Also, we see a tremendous degree of over-responsibility. It's as if he is we know the way that the story is set up, it is like in reality that he is the one person staving off Potter from Bedford Falls becoming Pottersville, but he has this great over-responsibility, and we see this in the story in that when the $8,000 goes missing, he doesn't pick up the phone and call any of his friends and call on them and ask them to help him. His wife does that. Yes. But psychologically, that is not open to this man to do it.
No.
He also says at one point in that brilliant scene Jimmy Stewart portraying it very, very well, George's despair. But when he prays to God, he says, that he's not a praying man. He won't even lean on God generally to help him.
Yeah.
So this is a man that has actually led quite a lonely life in a way, of great independence and great sense of responsibility, too responsible. And he can't remotely ask anyone to help him out. What we see from a Karen Horney perspective is that he is that moving towards character. And as you know, what that would mean is that his chief virtue, or what chief ideal, is to be as loving and as agreeable and as compliant as he can be. And we see the compulsive nature of that with George, because he cannot call on anyone to help him. That seems wrong. He is there to help others. Others are not there to help him.
Yeah, I think so. That was exactly what was going through my mind there as you depicted that very, very well. I think that is absolutely what we see in his psychology, actually. On the one hand, when he's, the more youthful and he's more exuberant and he has these dreams, you could, a Karen Horney might construe that as his more expansive drives are at play. And so he has a bit of buoyancy about him. But of course, what happens to the moving away type, as we discussed in our last podcast, moving towards type, as we discussed previously, is that this repression of aggression and this veering towards altruism and giving inevitably results in a loss of confidence, because you can't feel like a whole integrated individual if you've repressed the expansive drives within yourself. So that is why I suppose it's implausible in a sense that a life of just sacrifice after sacrifice in that way could lead to a truly happy person, actually, taking aside the kind of religious scenario that's built up here. Yeah, precisely because they couldn't be an integrated self, actually. They haven't allowed the growth of the other sides. They're too much stuck in the people pleasing. And I know that maybe seems very mean to describe George Bailey as a people pleaser. I think that's simplistic, but nevertheless, psychologically, the moving towards type is a people pleaser, actually, and that is the compulsion.
True. Well, I mean, I know what you're saying, that when we call him a people pleaser, it almost makes him sound ordinary and mundane, but there is an element of that in his character. I mean, one of the most significant aspects of this movie is that, and it was only when I watched it recently that I noticed it, which is that when Clarence shows him what life would be like if he had never lived, what we see is that George isn't able to take in that message. Instead, what we see him do is run up to people and in despair that they don't recognise him. And what we see then is the nightmare of that moving towards type, of non-recognition, of being a stranger to those that you love. That is his nightmare. So it's actually, because we see it in nightmarish form, we see one of the key motivations for George, which is recognition and helping those that you love. And so his nightmare is not to get that recognition.
See, that's an interesting point, that, because what's striking about that sequence is that, from maybe a more modern perspective, the culmination of that nightmare sequence, the idea that he discovers his wife is actually a librarian and an old maid, this is kind of seen as this bombshell, which could seem a bit funny in a way that was the ultimate nightmare. But you're right, from a moving towards perspective, the failure of his wife, the person he loves the most, to see him and love him back is the ultimate nightmare, actually. So that is the bombshell for him there. Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
I mean, it is with his wife, but it's the same with his mum. It's the same with the taxi driver. It's his nightmare not to be recognised by the people that he cares about, which is the community and also his family.
Yeah.
And I think this also explains why, when he is in that very tight spot with the money going missing, why it lunges him into despair, because what he imagines is that the population, the citizens of Bedford Falls, will be accusatory towards him, and so it's like he is no longer loved, and he'd rather die than have that love withdrawn from him. And so we can see one of the dangers about being compulsively altruistic, in that, as you say, you have to quell your expansive drives, your drives to become a more substantial self through achievement. You have to quell them. But we also see that how it is with his family and with Bedford Falls in general. Really there.
Well, that would explain, wouldn't it, why when he goes to Potter in his moment of desperation, and Potter suggests that, as I mentioned, the rabble, he's cynical about whether they would dare help George. George would be influenceable in that sense, because he would share, wouldn't he, from that compulsive perspective, scepticism and doubt about others, about the genuineness of their care, precisely because if he was too much stuck in that moving towards position, he couldn't really have a faith in others, actually, or himself.
Exactly.
Entirely, yeah.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this is what I was thinking as well, which is that it's not something that I've ever read elsewhere or people talking about, but yes, unfortunately, George does lack a degree of faith in the goodness of other people. And as you say, Potter articulates his doubts for him. To some extent, that's the function of Potter, is that he articulates George's despised self, or how George fears that he really is like.
Yes.
When Potter says, you're nothing but a clerk or something like that, you can almost see that as George's estimation of himself when he's in his most self-hating of moods. And when Potter says about the mob that they won't bail him out, again, I think they're articulating his own doubts on some level, and that's why he goes off to kill himself.
Well, and of course, going to Potter, knowing as he does what kind of person Potter is, there's something quite masochistic there. It's like it's almost given his self-hate an opportunity to punish himself by going to the man that is the cruelest, stingiest man in town. Although he is the man with money, he knows what Potter is, but yet he goes there, rather than to his friends, actually, which is interesting.
Well, exactly. It seems almost perverse, doesn't it? But I think that what it comes down to is that he can believe and trust in getting a loan from Potter, whereas to reach out for his friends, that's almost like going against his sense of what is right, because he helps them. They don't help him. This is the problem about being overly altruistic, is that it doesn't work the other way. And as you said, he lacks that faith in others to some extent too. So he avoids that, and he rushes to what would have otherwise been his doom.
Yes.
Really there. I think what's really important here, though, is that we look at, as much as we can, why that's happened. Really, why is there that void, that lack of faith in him? And I think one of the reasons for that is that if you're compulsively altruistic up to a point, it is that it hollows out the self, because you have sidelined your own needs. You've squashed them. In a way, you've suffocated them through this compulsive altruism. And so you don't call upon your own needs. You don't recognize them. Or if you do, you certainly don't see them as important as other people. And so in a kind of, perverse way, you turn yourself into a tool for others. You are a means to their end. That is your purpose. There is a somewhat dehumanizing element there, because your purpose is there for others. They are not there for you. Well, that's fine if you're a hammer, but not a human being.
Well, exactly, yeah, and it is, of course, the dark side of that kind of compulsive altruistic temperament is just, that inability to have a more straightforward, affectionate and mutual connection with others, actually, because you need to feel a certain amount of self-confidence. You need a certain amount of faith in yourself to then have the faith in others, because you can't believe they could have faith in you if you feel hollow, I guess, in that sense. So it's a kind of vicious circle, actually, there that compulsive altruistic type would be stuck in, actually, which is so damaging.
Well, that's it. I mean, as Karen Horney wrote about, the moving towards type fears the people that they help. So in a way, the altruism is and as far as the altruism is compulsive, it is a form of appeasement, really.
Yes.
So while George trusts the people of Bedford Falls quite a lot more than Potter does, he still lacks a degree of faith in them. And unfortunately for him, that lack of faith is more toxic, more dangerous than Potter's lack of faith, at least in terms of his life.
Well, indeed, culminating, of course, in the attempt, the suicide attempt, which obviously is, it's divine intervention, literally, that prevents this. So this is not a good state for this man to be in, who ostensibly has a wonderful wife, has these wonderful children, of course has hit a terrible dilemma in his life, and he fears the consequences of that. But yeah, it does seem like not the reaction of somebody who is actually a balanced, stable self, that choice there to just throw it all away, but potentially to throw it away.
Well, no. And as you know from reading Karen Horney, the moving toward type is more likely to try to commit suicide than the moving against type, which is Potter.
Of course.
They are more endangered in that way. And when he sees that nobody recognises him, acknowledges him in Bedford Falls, when he has that dark night of the soul, that is his nightmare, really. Of course, the nightmare in reality was that he was going to get a form of recognition that was tremendously unwanted, which was that the citizens of Bedford Falls would come and accuse him of misappropriation of funds. That was of course, he didn't realise that the people of Bedford Falls knew him intimately, and trusted his goodness, but he himself lacked a faith in that goodness, and that will be partly because that goodness had a compulsive aspect to it. It'll be also because he was such an exceptional human being that the goodness came so easily to him, and so he probably didn't acknowledge how exceptional it actually was.
Yeah, too. I think so. The final issue we're going to discuss here, which you've just mentioned there, this lovely scene at the end, this very moving moment where we see this extreme generosity of these friends and neighbours coming to George's rescue. You alluded there to his outstanding qualities and people perceiving these things in him. So do you think that this gesture of altruism at the end is primarily due to George's popularity or his likability, or would you think that there might be other factors at play that would explain why everybody came en masse to his rescue?
Well, I'm going to do that typical critic thing of bursting the party balloons, as it's often seen.
Okay.
And well, I mean, not quite. I'm obviously being facetious overall, but it is a moving scene. It is a great conclusion to a great movie. But I think, again, if we're talking about it in the way that we have over the last hour, that we have to acknowledge that it had to end in that way, because it is a moral conclusion to a morality tale. So it had to be very emphatic to prove that George's life had not been in vain.
Yes.
It was also a psychological resolution for George, because, as we said, his nightmare was not being recognised or valued at all by those that he loved. And this is the precise opposite. This is the dream of the family, the friends and acquaintances all being around and singing Auld Lang Syne. That is his dream. Yeah. And it is a moral and psychological resolution to the whole story. It is so powerful that it obviously overlooks the complexities that we've discussed. Yes. That are actually in this story.
Sure.
It sweeps them away in a triumph of emotion. Does that mean it's sentimental? I won't even go into that because we're probably going to lose Twitter followers if we start critiquing it in that way.
Yes.
But I think, yes, it did have to end in that emphatic way to prove that George's life had not been in vain, and also Capra's moral vision is the good and the right way to be.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, well, how about this? So maybe just to, take a slightly different angle on it then. I was thinking about this.
A more popular angle.
A popular, of course, yeah, I'm going to try and retrieve it there, yeah. No, I do agree with your take there. I was just thinking as well that what we could say is that, most people who are decent would have it in them to do that for a friend, although they at times won't do that, but most people have it in them. And I was thinking you could say that, you could have a kind of coalescing of circumstances which can bring out that kind of mass kindness. It occurred to me that there is a kind of modern day equivalent here whereby you will often have maybe a story that's promoted on social media about somebody who's had a terribly unfortunate bit of luck in their life or is doing something really exceptionally kind, and it moves people, and you'll get these donations whereby lots of money will be raised in a short time for that person. So people do quite enjoy actually having an opportunity to channel the part of them that likes to give and likes to be good. And sometimes there can just be a sort of a moment that captures people's imagination, and it's being shared and it's being discussed. So there could be a kind of, reciprocal influence going on there where like-minded people and friends all really get into the spirit of that kind of moment of real kindness. And of course, there's also the fact that in these kind of smaller, close-knit communities, there could be the norm of looking after each other, actually, where people do face financial hardship often and survive by the way that they pull together. And again, it seems a wee bit like George has overlooked that kind of obvious fact about these communities, that's how the community's built. There are the figures like the shark, the potter out there, but everybody else survives by pulling together. So I thought that maybe it could be read in a sense as that, we all do have those higher needs in us. They can be roused in certain moments, and people who maybe are more secure, from a Maslow point of view, their deficiency needs are more met, could be more easily roused to that moment of mass generosity. I guess that could be one way to maybe offer a kind of explanation that could account for that kind of action, rather than it just being a kind of, purely in terms of it's kind of being a sort of sentimental, emotional conclusion as well.
That's a good point, that there are those people that are altruistic, that help each other, as you say, parts of small communities or online. As we know in America, those that don't have health insurance often rely on crowdfunding, and people do help out. So, of course, there's that. Maybe the reason why I was a bit more cautious in how I read it was that I was thinking about it in terms of things like family in real life and things like that families don't bandy together necessarily as lovingly as is portrayed in that movie. But I think you're right when it comes to friends or even acquaintances, that altruism does exist, of course. But what I was just a bit cautious about was how easily it comes in that movie. Obviously, we're swept away by the emotional logic of the movie, but just because I was thinking about it more from that mental health perspective, and aware of how some people have been so altruistic but so unrewarded as well, particularly in families. That's one of the ironies here, is that I think, friends and acquaintances or even strangers can bandy together and support a person in that kind of way, but families often struggle to do so.
I agree, and that's I think in those kind of scenarios that I was maybe pitching there, I think what I really meant was that it is quite an exceptional moment. It isn't something we see that often, although we do see examples of it. So I guess it was kind of intriguing that what could the ingredients be that realistically might make that mass generosity take place. And I think you're right. I think that the sad reality is, of course, sometimes people miss moments where they could, they don't. And again, from a Maslow point of view about their own needs, it is a growth. It is a growth need we have to give and be kind to others. That there's no doubt many people suffer from a dearth of it, both in terms of what they're able to give or what they get at their moments of need. That's certainly true.
I think like what we're both trying to do is strike a balance between a sentimental outlook and a misanthropic one. Obviously.
Yes, exactly.
And that the truth lies somewhere between those two perspectives. And yes, it is an exceptional moment in the movie, and it would be an exceptional moment, no doubt, in real life when these things happen. But yes, it's not something that we can necessarily count on. No. I mean, I suppose why I'm emphasising this is, if we mention Karen Horney again, actually, that she talks about the kind of unwritten pacts that people make with destiny in her book Neurosis and Human Growth.
Okay, yeah.
I'm sure you recall that.
Yeah.
And what she means by that is that, some people could have this view that if they're altruistic, if they're very giving, then life and fate will reward them in return. And of course you could see that with some people, that when they give, they've got an expectation of getting at least something, some recognition.
Yes.
And that may not happen, and that could be deeply painful as well, to them.
I think that's the point, isn't it? I think that, this is a great movie, but there are a few mental health warnings actually that are maybe useful to accompany it, not because we want to be cynical, as you said, or misanthropic or anything like that actually, but just because it is dangerous. It is dangerous, and many people suffer from an attempt to be too altruistic and to think that will solve their problems and actually get them what they really want in life.
Yes.
And that is actually, a wrong-headed approach that could be very damaging, So we just have to caution against that.
I think
really
so, yeah. I mean, it's not as though we're saying that it necessarily has to come with a government health warning on the DVD, but it is the case that there is a strong temptation in human nature to take people for granted if someone is too kind to them.
Yes.
And this is something that my good man Pinter portrayed brilliantly in The Caretaker.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Which we see in that play that Davis the tramp is taken in by Aston. That there is this act of generosity, and it's clear that Davis could stay, provided he behaved himself. But unfortunately, Davis is riddled with ingratitude, and he despises Aston, and he ends up trying to align against Aston and ends up getting kicked out of the house and is homeless again. But we can see there that kindness isn't always rewarded in kind. No. There, and I do think there is a tendency in human nature to take for granted kindness, especially if it becomes routine. Like a George,
yes,
really. There, it could become very routine and expected. So that I think is one of the main warnings, if you want to put it that way, that we have to give here.
I think so. You just gave me the fascinating idea that if Pinter had rewritten It's a Wonderful Life, what kind of film would it have been? Which is quite a thought. But
I just don't think there'd be any guardian angel in Pinter's rewrite of It's a Wonderful Life.
No, I don't think
there'd be a lot of pauses and menace and power games. Really there, but it would not be the world that Capra depicted. No. And I think what we're kind of saying, if I know this sounds a bit strange, but I think what we're kind of saying is that the world is so complex and multifaceted that there are Capra-like elements to life, and there's also Pinteresque elements to life, and that's why we should try and be as good as we can be as people, but we have to keep our wits about us.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, ultimately, it is, despite the health warnings and the critique that we've maybe offered there, this is a fantastic film, and you're right. I mean, there's no question that it's uplifting because it's resonating with something in us. Actually, this is a part of us, the part that really recognises and is warmed by goodness. So that's there. I think you're right, but of course, there wasn't really room for the Pinteresque. I mean, we have Potter, of course. We have a kind of, as you described, a more one-dimensional out-and-out villain there. But of course, Pinter's doesn't really quite do villains like that. His are more... No. Again, they're more nuanced and they're more complex, and obviously, as is life, of course, the Pinteresque as well. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what Capra's depicted is how people could be spiritually rich, and what Pinter depicted in his great plays is how we could be spiritually impoverished.
Yes,
really, and I have to say, I know that I wrote my thesis on Pinter, so maybe I'm a bit biased here, but I have to say that what we have to keep in mind is that unfortunately it's easier to be impoverished in that regard than to be rich. To be rich in that way requires effort and wisdom, really.
Yes. I think so. I think that is the slight limitation with the Capra world in this film. This kind of standout single villain, where in a way there's more kind of mundane selfishness of a Potter-esque type, operating in the everyday. It's not really so much. It's a kind of more black and white world there of
well, I mean,
the bad.
Well, it is. I'm afraid, and as I walk home tonight and look around, I don't think I see Bedford Falls. It seems closer to Pottersville, really.
Yeah.
And so we have to bear in mind about what is easier to be and what might be winning in a lot of ways.
Yes, exactly.
So on that upbeat note.
Yes. And this is why, Pinter is less popular at Christmas time than...
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, not many people sit down and watch a Pinter play, on Christmas Day. No. You might argue that some poor people don't need to. It's at the actual table, but that's another story.
Indeed. But yes, but no, I think, so, in spite of all the myriad of health warnings, it is still a great movie, and I do actually love Capra's films. I think this is actually... one of the best films of that period, actually.
Yes, yeah. I think you would underscore that we still think it's a great movie, just in case people were in doubt. But it should be.
No.
It is a great movie, and it's got a great message, but we're just adding some qualifications to it, and we're adding them just to help people as much as they can with their lives.
Exactly. I think so. No, I think it might seem a bit perverse that a kind of, a more realist type reading of the film could have a kind of ethical agenda behind it. But I think that is what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to sour something that people love. It's really about trying to help people. Yeah, have a world view that's going to be good for them. Actually, that's going to help them make the right choices.
If people thought that kind of critique sullied it, so it spoiled it for them, then I think they've been looking at it too sentimentally, because I think the goodness that Capra believes in and depicts has a genuine quality to it, and it can survive our critique as we wanted it to.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Excellent. Well, I guess we can leave it at that. I think we've covered a lot of ground there, Alex. So thank you very much again, as always.
Thank you.